I'd now like to invite Yin Lee of ACJC to continue the proposition's case.
I put forth to you, Sir Winston Churchill's England back then did not have the problems of climate change, did not have the problems of global warming that we face today. So in the face of what Anne, the minister, has brought up to you, we say that the entire first opposition has failed to recognize the policy and the reasons for which we put forth. And I would just like to flesh that out. So maybe I challenge the next and subsequent speakers to try and deal forth with what the government is trying to flesh out to you today. Essentially, that's what is debate anyway. We said... No, thank you. Firstly, we said that, look, we have conditions, and these are the benefits that we see about. Carbon emissions help to reduce climate change, clean air, healthier air, less respiratory diseases. We say that we also encourage the corporate people to look at switch-as-you-go policies, which means that we encourage people now to conserve energy and use more efficient means. We say that also recycling leads to an ease of depletion of natural resources, and that means that, ladies and gentlemen, today we see less waste, easing pressure on landfills and incinerators. Please deal with that because our case is still standing after the first speaker. Now, essentially today, what we say to the three main lines contention that I see forth on them is that firstly, we want to talk about this alternative policy that they want to say today. Direct environmental legislation is essentially the name of their game. And I quote them by saying that, look, it really is about direct control over the kind of problems that we have. And I tell you that there are actually very, very dangerous implications about talking about the kind of intervention in the market forces and industries that they are saying. They want to dictate these economies and on what kind of machinery that you can purchase. And we say that is a very dangerous slippery slope because the sliding scale of difference is something that is very extreme, and I would like some clarification.
Well, the fact is, this legislation has been in place for many years, and we clearly see that it works because Singapore has already achieved.
Thank you, madam. That mechanism has been in place for many years. That's why climate change is in fact happening. That's why Singapore is number 36 on the list of 245 countries of carbon emission countries. And we say that we need to reduce that, and that is the government's aim, working hand in hand with the Ministry of Environment to try and lower that and raise Singapore's profile in the fight against global warming, which we recognize as a prominent problem. So we say today that we need a more nuanced approach to this. Taxes hurts the industry, and I was to point out in my rebuttal here, over the producer and consumer, we say that on the first main tier, the producers actually now find it more expensive to produce, and therefore this means that they pass on the cost to their consumers. And this means, ladies and gentlemen, they incentivize to really try and stop the kind of pollution so that they won't have to pay the tax. No, thank you, madam. Essentially, on the whole notion of consumer behavior, we say that, look, the consumers will act. As we showed you in the ERP, it leads to a 25% decrease in traffic on the road, to 250,000 cars moving less over a peak hour period. We say that these are the kind of examples of effective consumer behavior because, as Anne has said, where it hurts the pockets of Singaporeans, that's where they will act. And we say that we want to bring up Jack Neal's money no enough. That's why we are acting in first place. Essentially today, I will talk about, as promised, about the strategic importance of conserving clean water. And the mechanism of clean water effectively sees us look at this. They say today that, look, we have to point out that our tax, in fact, looks at producers of water inefficient products, because we are talking about the kind of washing machines and toilets. And these are, in fact, water-based products where you have to consume a lot of water in the production and, in fact, of the usage of these products. We say we want to tax them, we want to cut down that kind of usage of those machinery. It naturally passes on the cost to the consumers as an increase in price levels, and this means less people want to buy it. And such products really now are more expensive. This forces people then to separate the wheat from the chaff and look for alternative water-efficient appliances. And the benefit, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, is that water resources are now an important energy resource as we look at the current situation, where Singapore, in fact, relies for 70% of its water supply from Malaysia and other countries. We say that we really need to relook at our water energy source for the future, because 1% of new water's accountability for our Singapore consumption is not going to be enough. In fact, there's only so many times you can visit the toilet anyway. So what we're saying is that essentially is that we cannot be utterly dependent on other countries for the provision of such an important energy source or basic necessity. And so really, let's conserve, let's look after our important resources, because ultimately we are responsible for our own well-being. We are encouraging efficiency of water. Let's go with the government.
I'd now like to invite Deborah, the second speaker on the proposition, to make her case for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that the proposition wants exactly what we want. We want the environment to be safe. But what they fail to realize is that their policy of having household taxes or making sure that waste is managed properly already exists in the status quo. Legislation already mandates that companies must fulfill a certain set of environmental criteria. It already mandates that households must see that they dispose of their waste properly. What the proposition needed to do was to tell us how their policy is a shift from the status quo and how it's different from just having legislation. Sarah challenged the second speaker to tell us exactly, thank you, madam, how their tax works. Who are they going to tax? What kind of industries will be exempted? What is the level of tax? Will we keep it tax neutral? However, the speakers failed to tell us that, and we can only assume that what they mean is a general tax imposed across all industries. However, as I will show you later, this tax is detrimental to Singapore's economic growth and will not solve environmental problems as well as our legislation does. Now, today I have two problems with their case today. The first is that of the household tax.
Madam?
No, thank you, sir. They tell us that a household tax is necessary. However, we see they have already agreed that we are in a technical recession. In this recession, if we are indeed to increase the household tax, what we see is that ordinary people will suffer. They will have to pay higher prices for thank you, madam, for consumer goods. Now, they tell us that it is possible for them to reduce the consumption in order to pay less tax. However, we see certain goods have a price inelastic demand, and it's impossible for them. No, thank you, sir. And it's impossible for them to reduce the consumption of this good. So what we say then, that along with this inelastic demand, we see that consumers will face an increasing higher amount that they have to spend every day, and we see that this will lead to this will lead to resentment against the government. And we say that this is not something that we all want. Yes, sir?
No, madam, because they look for other alternatives, such as inefficient...
No, thank you, sir. So I ask you, what kind of alternatives you have? You suggest a blanket household tax. So I will assume that this means, say, a tax on things such as electricity and the usage of water. What other alternatives are there for such price inelastic goods such as water and electricity? Singaporeans will not be able to go to Malaysia and be like, oh, there's cheaper water here. Perhaps I should use it in order to reduce the tax I have to pay. So we see that their point clearly does not stand. Now, moving back to my speech. And so we see that household tax clearly does not work because of the fact that there are all these detriments, such as bringing resentment, and we say that this is not something that we want for our country. Now, secondly, they told us that tax will solve the problem. And it came up the example of how, if legislation works, then why does Singapore still face the problem of pollution? Well, I tell you, this problem of pollution comes from other sources, such as the factories in Johor Bahru, which have pollution which transcends national boundaries and comes to Singapore. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, what we must focus on is on the pollution that we control, the pollution from the manufacturing sector in our own country. And we see that the manufacturing sector contributes 26% of Singapore's annual GDP, according to the Bank of Morgan Stanley. No, thank you, sir. And if we are indeed to impose this tax, the companies, foreign investors, will no longer have an incentive to invest in Singapore. Sarah gave the example of how most companies choose Singapore for the sole reason that we have one of the lowest corporate taxes in the world. If we are indeed If we are indeed to take away this advantage, what we see is a result in investors refusing to come to Singapore and moving to cheaper countries. In fact, because legislation... In fact, because legislation happens in nearly every single country in the world, with our current system of legislation, we do not have a disadvantage compared to other nations. But because taxes are only present in 5 cities in the world, Sweden and the San Francisco Bay Area, we say that in this case, we have a definite disadvantage if we are indeed to have taxes, because of the fact that most countries do not have taxes yet.
Madam.
No, thank you, sir. And so we say that taxes are in fact detrimental to our economic growth and do not solve the problem of pollution at all. Now move on to my case on how taxes are inflexible and not as good as legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, tax is a blunt instrument. It is like using a hammer to kill an ant. You will kill the ant, but you will also spoil the floor in the process. With legislation, Provision 75 of the Environmental Pollution Control Act will allow the minister to exempt any company from any provision in the Act. If a company cannot cut down emissions because it is not cost effective, what they can do is to negotiate with the government so that they are able to find another way to make the operations carbon neutral instead of being forced to reduce emission levels. We say that this provides a lot of flexibility for companies because then they are able to choose exact form of policy, the exact form of operations that will allow them to be carbon neutral and yet still be carbon effective. In a system of taxes, because taxes are imposed uniformly, companies still have to pay a certain amount of money regardless of what other measures they take to reduce their carbon emissions. It dictates a single method that a company must use and is highly ineffective. So you see, taxes are highly inflexible in this regard because they also do not accurately represent a company's effect on the environment. A company that is carbon neutral will be taxed the same amount as another company that is not, but pollutes the same amount. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not use a hammer because it spoils the floor, but let's keep the floor intact and go with our side of the floor. Thank you.